Prostitution was hell, but pornography was even worse. These were the memorable words told to us several years ago by a woman we call Katya. Katya had first been trafficked into the pornography industry and eventually ended up in prostitution. She described how prostitution was an absolute nightmare, but that exploitation in pornography was for her even worse. She told us how she couldn't bear the thought of men and boys masturbating to images of her being abused and exploited. So as Gail mentioned, my name is Meghan and I'm the research director at Talita. We're an NGO based in Sweden providing holistic support and an exit program to women exploited in prostitution, pornography, and human trafficking for sexual exploitation. In our daily work, we come face to face with the consequences of sexual exploitation: anxiety, depression, dissociation, eating disorders, self-harm, suicidal ideation, even attempt, and other painful ways of coping. We provide a safe place where women can work through past traumas, understand their inherent worth, and pursue the life they want. Katya is just one of the many survivors who have helped clarify for us the link between prostitution and pornography. When it comes to this link, I'll start by saying that our colleagues at the Swedish police have witnessed a link between pornography consumption and the demand for purchasing women in prostitution. So here you see a quote by Criminal Inspector Simon Hagström, who explains that when he and his colleagues go through sex buyers' phones and computers, they find huge amounts of pornography. This observation is also backed up by Swedish and international research on sex buyers, where frequent pornography consumption has been found to be strongly associated with sex purchase. And that's Simon's book there. I recommend everyone buy it if you haven't already. So after our conversation with Katya and other survivors, we really wanted to know more about women's experiences in pornography production. And we wanted to understand kind of what the pornography industry looked like in our own context. So that's why we set out to conduct an exploratory study of women's experiences in pornography production in Sweden. For the study, I first performed a mapping of the industry. So I looked at, okay, how and where is the pornography being produced? Where is the content being bought and sold? And what kind of recruitment, or what I like to call ensnarement methods, are being used? I conducted in-depth interviews with 9 women with experiences in pornography production in Sweden. And it's worth noting that the 9 that I interviewed, I would say, are not the most vulnerable women. So already the insights and themes, I think, say a lot, and we need to understand that those women currently controlled by pimps and traffickers were not able to participate. The study was first released in the form of a report that you see on the left, and then later published in the academic journal Dignity, a journal of analysis of exploitation and violence. So today I'll be sharing some of the themes and insights that emerged from that research study. The first finding was that much of today's pornography industry is hardly recognizable compared to how the industry looked not that long ago. The pornography industry today has collided with social media, where, for instance, Snapchat Premium and so-called social media platform OnlyFans is where much of today's online sexual exploitation occurs. And I know that Dr. Amanda Sanchez and Dr. Eric Silverman are going to really dissect this link more in depth later on during the conference, so please stay tuned. Now, Dr. Gail Dines also discussed how today's culture really grooms young girls direct into the hands of pimps, including porn pimps. And that's exactly what the women I interviewed explained. A woman I'll call Jenny said this: "In today's society, we're all about selfies, and we learn that we should get as many likes as possible. Young people are most affected by this culture. Their boundaries end up being pushed further and further, and then the next step, selling images, is actually very small. All it takes is for someone to say, why not earn money instead of likes?" I thought that was pretty profound. Jenny and the other women described how porn pimps actively recruit young women and girls by writing directly to them on social media accounts like Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. And they intentionally use terms like blogging and glamour modeling to appeal to young women and girls growing up in a culture where they're bombarded by the message that their worth is defined by whether or not they are seen online. I mean, think of how many young girls look up to and idolize influencers and models with their own blogs. They write, "Are you our next top blogger? Why sit on likes when you can get paid? Tag someone you think should blog on our website." Anyone under the right circumstances can be caught in the snares of these predators. That said, porn pimps are well aware that they will have an easier time ensnaring, maintaining, and profiting off of those who are most vulnerable and who lack societal protection. So one woman put it like this: these men, they go after the weakest. They're nasty men out there who groom young girls and try to get their way. The woman I interviewed described how these men target young women and girls who are struggling financially, who are suffering from poor mental health, and many of whom have been subject to earlier sexualized violence and abuse. And it was clear that not only the earlier violence itself, but also how their communities responded to that violence impacted their pathway into the pornography industry. Now note that these are some of the same vulnerability factors we see in prostitution and other forms of sexual exploitation. And typically, it's not one, but several vulnerability factors that propel young women and girls into the sex trade. A woman I'll call Sarah explained, "When I was 20, I had a boyfriend who was controlling, sexually violent, and extremely aggressive. He put me in a lot of debt, and I think that's why I ended up in the industry." So here you see Sarah was young, she was subject to systematic violence, she was in an economic crisis and lacking societal support. It's tragic because instead of someone helping her out of that situation into safety, the only person who reached out to her was a pimp, and she saw it as her way to escape. So from violence and exploitation to more violence and exploitation. And by calling it blogging, modeling, porn pimps are able to disguise the nature of the images and films that women and girls are expected to partake in. Because ultimately, it is the buyer's demand that determines what content they have to end up taking part in. These are some of the titles I came across during my research. Just reading the titles is often enough to grasp what this industry is all about. Pornography eroticizes violence, incest, racism, human trafficking, torture, and the abuse of women and girls. The first title, Toilet Mouth Rape, Face Flushed in the Toilet After Forced to Suck Cock. This is nothing other than the torture technique, waterboarding. And in fact, since I conducted the research, the websites have become noticeably more explicitly violent, degrading, and misogynistic. Another unique characteristic of today's pornography industry is that women are kind of expected to interact with buyers, or so-called fans, who may subject them to harassment, verbal abuse, and psychological abuse, like Amanda's experiences. One of her fans wrote to her at one point saying, "Your child will have to go to high school and have to defend something that you have done. You're disgusting, you're dirty, you should be stoned, you should be raped." I find it ironic that without his demand for access to her body, she would not be selling those images. And yet she is the one that is shamed. Another woman said, "It's this constant defense of my integrity and my body. I have to defend it all the time, and that's really draining in the long run." A number of women described experiences of porn buyers' harassment escalating into stalking behavior where they feared for their safety. Now, during the interviews, it was very evident that just like women in other forms of prostitution, women exploited in pornography do everything in their power to resist the violence they're exposed to. So for instance, they use fake names or take on another persona to separate their true self from the part that's being bought and sold, and really to protect themselves from harassment, being doxxed, where people spread personal information about them, or being subject to stalking. They also have very clear boundaries about what they are willing to do and what they aren't willing to do. So that's not the problem. They have really strict boundaries. It's that men, the buyers, don't respect those boundaries. They try to push them further and further. And of course, we know that the more vulnerable the woman is, the more difficult it is to resist the men's demands. A woman I'll call Anna described it like this: in this industry, you're no longer human. You become a thing that can be bought, sold, and used. And I would argue that that's the common denominator for all forms of sexualized exploitation. Vulnerable individuals dehumanized and used for someone else's pleasure. It's the ultimate colonial relationship. And as I saw in my research, it's very common to experience this in more than one type of sexual exploitation. So most of the women I interviewed had other experiences in so-called sugar dating. There's nothing sugar or sweet about prostitution. Camming, so-called striptease or escort prostitution. And other research also corroborates this observation that women move from different forms, different contexts, from online to offline. And a recent study also found that the legal definition of human trafficking was present, not surprisingly, in all forms of sexual exploitation. I think it's worth saying that pimps and traffickers are always trying to find ways to minimize their risks and maximize their profits. So by finding new ways to conceal their product, repackaging their product, they're able to kind of disguise what it is that's actually going on. And we end up doing them a service when we separate and compartmentalize these different faces of the same system. The overlap between pornography, prostitution, and human trafficking for sexual exploitation has become even clearer since the allegations and complaints made against Pornhub and their parent company, MindGeek. And I think Gail mentioned MindGeek. So they're the largest pornography so-called company or pimp, global pimp in the world. And a lawsuit from last year showed how MindGeek partnered with known pimps and traffickers. The complaint read, in one visit to a production site in East Asia, MindGeek executives witnessed a football field-sized warehouse in which women were crammed into adjoining studio stalls like livestock to perform on camera. Many of the women were young and were engaged in scenes depicting underage girls. The women who were victimized by this trafficking network reported that when they tried to leave, they were informed that their cam sessions had been recorded, and that if they did not continue performing, the trafficker would send copies to their families and otherwise release them publicly and destroy their reputation and future. So that brings up a really, really important aspect of the harm of pornography, because what makes pornography uniquely harmful is that the images remain online indefinitely. Rebecca explained, I think that many who want to exit the industry don't dare to, because all the images are online for the entire world to see. In our work at Talita, we see how grueling the exit process from prostitution is. It requires a tremendous amount of support, of willpower, dedication, and courage. So for women exiting from pornography, the exit may be that much more difficult because their abuse images remain online for the world to see, as one woman put it. The women I interviewed described the fear of their kids, friends, neighbors, or even bosses stumbling upon their images. In fact, one woman shared how a random guy downtown came up to her and asked her, hey, would you be interested in taking part in another gangbang? This is long after she had exited. And of course, imagine the kind of the trauma that would kind of resurface in that instance. So the question I always get is, well, what do we have to do? Something must be done. What can we do to combat sexual exploitation? Talita was already describing a little bit about this legislation, the Sex Purchase Act here in Sweden, and then mentioning that France has gone even further than that. But basically, we need legislation that targets the demand for sexual exploitation. The equality model, or the Swedish model, is, as we found, the only way to do so. But it needs to apply to all forms of sexual exploitation, both online and offline. We can't let pimps and traffickers always be a step ahead, finding new forms of the same brutal exploitation. We need to make sure that our laws, policies are updated and all-encompassing on all forms. And we need to understand pornography for what it is, filmed prostitution. It's also absolutely essential that holistic, long-term support is available so that survivors of sexual exploitation actually have real alternatives. So the women I interviewed spoke of the need for vocational training and education, psychological and social support. And these are kind of the exact same needs that we've seen for decades that we've been working with women in prostitution. And finally, we need prevention. In order to promote early identification and dignified protection support, we need to see systematic training and education of the police, social services, and other relevant societal actors. And of course, Gail already touched upon this. Parents and schools have a huge responsibility and opportunity in keeping children safe from sexual exploitation, but also informing them about what pornography actually is, how it affects consumers, but also especially how it affects the individuals exploited in the industry. And these are the kind of three pillars that have been really the focus in Sweden when it comes to prostitution. And we've seen that these three aspects are absolutely key, need to be all in place. But here we need to extend it even to online sexual exploitation, pornography, and other newer forms of sexual exploitation.